The Wardenclyffe ballroom smelled of gardenias and old money. Chandeliers threw soft gold across 200 faces, all of them practiced in the particular art of looking effortlessly at ease while being watched. Somewhere above the murmur, a 12-piece orchestra tuned itself into a waltz nobody was dancing to yet. This was the annual Harrow Foundation Gala, the kind of night where a single centerpiece cost more than most people's rent, and where every guest understood, without needing to be told, that the real event of the evening was not the charity auction printed on the program. It was each other. Julian Whitfield stood near the terrace doors, a glass of untouched champagne sweating in his hand, watching the room the way a man watches weather, waiting to see which direction it would turn. "You're doing the thing again," said Cecilia Marsh, gliding up beside him in a green gown that matched the Foundation's logo a little too deliberately. She ran the Harrow Foundation's board and had known Julian since business school, standing in the corner like a bouncer at his own engagement party. "I'm observing," Julian said. "You're always observing. It's unsettling at parties. People like to be looked at, Julian, not studied." He almost smiled. Almost. Across the room, his fiancée, Solange Reyes, held court near the auction stage, laughing at something a senator's wife had said, her diamond earrings catching the light every time she tilted her head, which she did often, because she had learned a long time ago that a beautiful woman tilting her head at the right moment could make an entire room feel like it was in on a secret. Solange was not cruel by nature. She had simply never been told no often enough for it to leave a mark. "She's radiant tonight," Cecilia offered, watching Julian's face for a reaction he didn't give. "She's always radiant," he said. "That's never been the question." Cecilia opened her mouth to ask what the question was, then thought better of it. Julian Whitfield had built and sold 2 companies before he was 35, and in all that time, people had learned that when he went quiet, it meant he was already 3 moves ahead of the room. Nobody rushed him. They just waited to see where the silence landed. Near the service corridor, half hidden behind a column dressed in white orchids, a woman in a black uniform folded linen napkins into perfect triangles with hands that moved like she'd done it 10,000 times before. Because she had. Her name was Abina Mensah, and she had worked catering events for the Harrow Foundation for 3 years, ever since arriving in the city with a duffel bag, a scholarship she never got to use, and a pair of dance shoes so worn the satin had gone the color of weak tea. She kept those shoes in her locker at the catering company, wrapped in a plastic bag, though she had not danced in them, not really danced, in over 2 years. Sometimes during breaks, she would touch the ribbon laces, just to remind herself of something. She was never quite sure what. Discipline, maybe. Or the version of herself that used to believe a stage was still possible. Tonight she was assigned to the champagne station, which meant she spent most of her evening invisible, which was, she'd found, the safest place to be in rooms like this. "2 minutes to auction," said her supervisor, passing behind her with a clipboard. "And smile. Rich people tip better when the help looks happy," Abina smiled. Not for the tip, but because smiling cost nothing, and she had learned to spend as little of herself as possible in places that weren't hers. The auction opened with the usual theater, a diamond bracelet, a week in Positano, a private dinner cooked by a chef whose name got a ripple of applause. Bidding paddles rose and fell like a tide nobody controlled. Solange Reyes won the Positano trip for a number that made a woman 2 tables over choke audibly on her wine, and she accepted the applause with the ease of someone catching a ball she knew was coming. It was during the lull after the 4th item, a signed cello nobody in the room played, that Priscilla Danes leaned toward Solange with the particular gleam of a woman who has just thought of something she believes is clever. "You should do the dance challenge," Priscilla said. "For the foundation. Everyone's doing it online. You put up money, someone has to match your steps, loser donates. It's practically a philanthropic Instagram trend at this point." Solange's eyes lit, delighted by the shape of an idea that let her be generous and entertaining at the same time. "That's actually brilliant, Pris." "You'd need a partner," Priscilla said, scanning the room with the casual cruelty of someone who has never had to think about who gets picked last. Her gaze snagged on the champagne station. What about her? Solange followed the look and found Abina, mid-pour, unaware yet that she had become the subject of anything. "The waitress?" Solange said, laughing. Not meanly, exactly. More the laugh of someone who has never once imagined herself in another person's shoes and therefore doesn't recognize the cliff edge she's standing on. "Oh, that's perfect. That's... Julian, come here, you have to hear this." Julian crossed the room at the sound of his name, arriving in time to hear the shape of the plan, but not yet its target. "I'm going to do a dance challenge for the foundation," Solange announced, already glowing with the anticipation of applause. $7,000 on the line. Whoever can't keep up with me on the floor, their side donates. I'm going to ask the girl at the champagne table. Julian's face did not move, which was, for those who knew him, the loudest possible reaction. "Solange," he said quietly. "Are you sure that's—" "It'll be fun," she said, already turning away, already halfway to the microphone in her mind. "It's for a good cause." He did not stop her. Later, several people in that ballroom would wonder why, whether it was hesitation, or permission, or something else they didn't yet have the vocabulary for. What none of them knew yet was that Julian Whitfield had spent the last 20 minutes of the evening watching the woman at the champagne station move, the economy of her steps, the way she pivoted around a service cart without spilling a drop, the particular carriage of someone whose spine remembered a discipline her job no longer required of her. He had already started asking himself a question. He simply wasn't ready to ask it out loud yet. The microphone crackled to life, and the room's attention swiveled toward the stage, the way a field of flowers turns toward light. "Good evening, everyone," Solange said, her voice carrying easily, trained by a decade of galas, exactly like this one. "I have a fun addition to tonight's fundraising, if the foundation will indulge me." A ripple of amused encouragement. Cecilia, sensing something she couldn't yet name, glanced toward Julian, who had gone very still near the terrace doors. "I'd like to challenge someone to a dance-off," Solange continued, smiling the smile that had gotten her onto magazine covers before she'd turned 25. $7,000 to the foundation, if I win. If she wins, well, she won't. But if she does, I'll match it. Laughter, warm and easy. The laughter of people who assumed the outcome before it happened. "I choose," Solange said, turning, pointing with a manicured finger toward the champagne station. Her. Every head in the ballroom turned. Abena stood very still, a bottle of champagne suspended mid-pour, aware suddenly of 200 sets of eyes landing on her all at once like weather changing. "Me?" she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried in the sudden hush, the way a single dropped glass carries in an empty hall. "Come on," Solange said, laughing, waving her forward with the easy confidence of someone who has never once had to wonder whether a room was laughing with her or preparing to laugh at someone else. "It'll be fun. For charity." Somewhere near the back, Priscilla Danes was already recording on her phone. Abina set the champagne bottle down with the same careful precision she used for everything, buying herself 3 seconds to decide what kind of woman she was about to be in front of a room that had already decided for her. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said. "Oh, don't be shy," Solange said, crossing the floor toward her, gown trailing like a comet. "I promise I won't embarrass you. Much." A ripple of laughter, not unkind exactly, but not kind either. The laughter of people entertained by a situation whose weight they hadn't bothered to lift. "It's not shyness," Abina said. Her voice had steadied. "I'm working. I'll clear it with your supervisor," Solange said breezily, already snapping her fingers toward the catering manager, who appeared within seconds, nodding vigorously, because a woman like Solange Reyes did not get told no by anyone whose paycheck touched the Harrow Foundation's budget. "See? Handled. $7,000. One dance. You'd be doing the foundation a favor." 200 faces waited. Somewhere in the crowd, Julian had not moved, had not spoken, was watching Abena's face with an intensity that Cecilia, standing close enough to notice, would later describe as a man watching to see if a bridge would hold weight. Abena looked at the small crowd of faces glowing with anticipation, looked at the orchestra conductor glancing uncertainly toward the stage for cues nobody had given him, and made a decision that had less to do with courage than with arithmetic. $7,000 was $7,000, and this foundation funded scholarships for girls exactly like the one she used to be. "Fine," she said, untying her apron. "One song." A ripple of applause, delighted, the crowd already treating the outcome as settled entertainment rather than a contest with a real person on either side of it. The conductor, after a whispered consultation, chose something with a driving Latin rhythm, bright horns, insistent percussion, the kind of piece built for showing off rather than subtlety. Solange kicked off her heels with theatrical flourish, to more laughter, and took the center of the floor like she'd been born standing in it. She was, credit where due, genuinely good. Years of private instruction had given her clean lines and confident hips, and she moved through the first 16 bars with the polish of someone who had never once doubted a room would applaud her. Abena stepped out of her flats. She did not have the shoes, not the real ones. Those were folded in plastic in a locker across town. She danced barefoot on cold marble, and for the first 8 bars, she looked exactly like what the room expected. Careful, tentative, a woman doing her best in shoes she hadn't chosen for this. Then something in her spine remembered itself. It happened so quietly that only a few people caught the exact moment. Cecilia did, and so did the orchestra's lead violinist, who nearly missed her entrance because her bow arm forgot to move. Abena's shoulders dropped a half-inch, her chin lifted. Her hips found the rhythm not by following Solange's lead, but by locating the actual pulse buried under the horns, the one a classically trained dancer hears before anyone else in the room does. She turned. It was a small thing, technically, a simple pivot turn, nothing acrobatic, but it was executed with a precision that made the difference between a woman dancing and a woman who had once been trained by someone who charged real money to teach exactly that kind of turn. The laughter in the room did not stop. It changed pitch. Solange, sensing the shift the way performers always sense when a room's attention has moved, raised her own difficulty. A series of quick turns, arms lifted, a flourish, designed to remind everyone who had issued this challenge. Abena matched it. Not aggressively, not competitively. She simply moved the way her body had been trained to move for 11 years before her scholarship money ran out along with everything else. And the room, which had gathered to watch a joke, found itself instead watching something it did not have a name for yet. "She's actually good," someone murmured near the bar. "She's better than good," said the violinist under her breath, still playing, eyes wide. By the second chorus, when Solange executed a fast spin, she'd clearly practiced for exactly this kind of moment. Abena mirrored it a beat later. Cleaner, quieter, without the flourish of a hand thrown up for applause. Simply the movement itself, complete and correct. The laughter had gone entirely by now. In its place sat something more uncomfortable. 200 people beginning to understand, in real time, that they had gathered to watch someone be humiliated, and were instead watching someone be revealed. Solange felt it too. It moved across her face in stages. First confusion, because the script she'd walked onto the floor with no longer matched what was happening. Then a flicker of something sharper, because being matched, for a woman who had never in her adult life been matched at anything in public, did not feel like fun anymore. She pushed harder. A final combination, fast, technically demanding, the kind of sequence meant to end things decisively. Abena executed it a half-second later, and where Solange's version ended in a flourish toward the crowd, Abena's ended simply, arms coming to rest, chin level, breath controlled, the expression of someone who had learned a long time ago never to perform triumph, because triumph, for a woman like her, had always been more dangerous than defeat. The orchestra held the final note a beat longer than written, as if even the musicians weren't sure the song was allowed to be over. Silence. Real silence. The kind ballrooms rarely produce. 200 people uncertain whether to applaud a maid who had just outdanced their host's fiancé in a game designed, without anyone quite admitting it, to prove the opposite. Solange broke the silence first, laughing, too brightly, the laugh of someone reaching for a rope that wasn't there. "Well," she said, she's got some moves, doesn't she?" A few scattered claps followed, uncertain, the kind of applause that exists to fill a silence rather than to honor anything. "Where did you learn to dance like that?" Priscilla asked, phone still raised, her tone somewhere between admiration and suspicion, as though quality in the wrong hands required explaining. Abina reached for her flats, sliding them back on with the same careful economy she brought to everything. "I used to study," she said simply, "a long time ago." "Study where?" Priscilla pressed. "Does it matter?" Abina said, not sharply, just tired. The particular tiredness of someone who has spent an entire evening being asked to prove she belonged somewhere she'd never claimed to belong in the first place. It was then that Julian crossed the floor. He had not moved for the entire dance. He moved now with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already decided something and was simply walking toward the moment where he'd say it. The room noticed him the way rooms notice weather changing. Solange turned toward him, already composing her face into the version of triumph she'd wanted the dance to produce. "Julian, wasn't that—" He didn't look at her. He was looking at Abena. "Where?" he said, and his voice, quiet as it was, filled the ballroom the way quiet voices do when everyone has been waiting all evening for a man to finally speak. "Did you learn to dance like that?" It was not the question Solange expected. It was not, really, a question anyone in the room expected, because on its surface, it seemed to simply repeat what Priscilla had already asked. But something in the way Julian asked it, the stillness underneath it, the sense that he already half knew the answer and needed only to hear it confirmed, made the entire ballroom go quiet in a different way than before. Abina hesitated. "The Ardsley Conservatory," she said finally. "I trained there for 11 years. I had a scholarship through my senior year." A pause. "It ended when the program lost its funding. I never got to finish." Julian nodded slowly, as if a puzzle piece he'd been holding for the better part of an hour had finally clicked into place. "The Ardsley Conservatory," he repeated. "Run out of the old Whitfield Arts Building on Grant Street." "Yes," Abina said, surprised he knew it. "My mother built that program," Julian said. "Before she passed. It lost its funding 6 years ago, when the foundation managing it collapsed after a fraud investigation. I've spent every gala since trying to figure out how to rebuild it without it looking like a publicity stunt." He looked at her directly now, and the whole room seemed to lean in an inch. "I watched you dance tonight, and I thought I recognized the training before I recognized anything else about you. I wasn't sure until you said the name." Solange's face had gone through several expressions in the space of 10 seconds, none of them comfortable. "You knew," she said slowly, to Julian, "and you didn't say anything." "I wasn't certain," Julian said. "And I wanted to see what would happen if I waited." He turned, finally, to face the room fully, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who rarely used more words than necessary, and therefore was always listened to when he did. "I've been quiet most of tonight because I've spent the last year trying to decide whether rebuilding my mother's program was something I could do quietly, without turning it into exactly this kind of spectacle. I think I just got my answer, and it's not the one I expected." He turned to Abina. "I'm not going to make this a scene. I think you've had enough of a scene made out of you tonight, but I'd like to fund your final year at Ardsley, wherever it operates now, if the offer means anything to you. Not tonight, not in front of everyone, but I wanted to say it while the truth was still standing in the room instead of the assumption." Abena did not cry, though several people near her did. She simply nodded, once, the way a person nods when they have spent a long time not letting themselves hope for something, and are being asked, gently, to start again. Solange stood very still in the middle of the dance floor, $7,000, and an audience she'd once controlled completely, now arranged around a truth she hadn't authored and couldn't perform her way out of. "I didn't know," she said quietly, to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone. "I just thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought it would be funny." "It might have been," Cecilia said gently, coming to stand beside her. "If she'd had anything to prove and lost. She didn't lose." Solange looked at Abena for a long moment. Really looked. The way she perhaps hadn't looked at anyone serving her drinks or clearing her plates in a long time. And something in her face softened into something closer to shame than performance. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time all evening, there was no audience calculation in her voice at all. That wasn't fair. Any of it. Abena considered her, then nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. It was not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but it was the door left open for it, which was, perhaps, more honest than forgiveness offered too quickly would have been. The orchestra, unsure what else to do, began to play again, softer this time, and the room slowly exhaled back into its ordinary conversations, though something in the air had shifted permanently, the way a room feels different after a window has been opened even after it's closed again. Later, much later, when the gala had wound down and the waitstaff had begun clearing linens, Abena found her worn dance shoes waiting in her bag exactly where she'd left them that morning. Small, tea-colored, the ribbon laces frayed at the ends from years of tying and untying before performances that had, for a long time, felt like they belonged to a version of her life that had already ended. She held them for a moment before packing them away, and understood, for the first time in longer than she could easily say, that they were not a relic of something lost. They were proof of something that had simply been waiting for the right room to recognize it. Dignity, it turned out, was never about being seen. It was about remaining whole, in the moments when no one was looking, so that when someone finally did look, there was something true left to find. The lesson of that evening spread quietly, the way real lessons tend to, without a headline or a hashtag, that the measure of a person is rarely found in the rooms built to flatter them, but in the ones built, however carelessly, to test them, and that quiet discipline, carried faithfully through years no one applauds, has a way of outlasting every spotlight built to diminish it. Solange would spend the following weeks reconsidering not just that night, but the ease with which she had assumed a room's laughter was harmless, simply because it was hers to command. Julian would spend the following year quietly rebuilding what his mother started, careful never to let the story become about himself. And Abena would return, eventually, to a stage, not because a billionaire had rescued her, but because she had never actually stopped being the woman who belonged there. He had simply been the first person in the room, willing to ask the question everyone else had been too comfortable to consider.